The day aliens learned why Earth is feared as a Class 13 nightmare. Part 1. The coffee was bad. It had always been bad on this station. Commander Nate Holt had stopped noticing somewhere around year 3 of his posting, the same way he had stopped noticing the hum of the ventilation system and the faint smell of recycled air that clung to everything. He poured a cup, set it on the console beside him, and looked at the screen. 1,400 ships. He looked at the number for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee and drank. Lieutenant Kara Voss was on the other side of the command deck, crouched behind a panel she had opened with a screwdriver she kept in her boot. She was watching a coolant pressure gauge on the secondary feed for Deck 7. It had been ticking upward for 6 minutes. Not fast. Not dramatically. Just steadily, in the way of things that become problems if you look away from them long enough. The fleet feed was running on every screen in the room. She was watching the gauge. "They came out of FTL clean," said the sensor officer, a young man named Pete Darrow who had a habit of stating the obvious when he was nervous. "No debris trail. Formation intact. 1,400 ships don't drift," Nate said. "They planned the jump." "Yes, sir." "Good for them." He refilled his coffee. The Vale Dominion fleet had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system 42 minutes ago. It had taken Nate's team 11 of those minutes to confirm what they were looking at, 14 more to run the identification protocols, and another 6 to wake the right people on Earth. The remaining 11 minutes had been spent in the particular silence of people who have trained for something their entire careers and are now watching it arrive on schedule. The communication channel opened. The translation software engaged. A voice came through, low, formal, the kind of voice that had given a lot of speeches to a lot of species that were no longer around to remember them. "This is Fleet Speaker Orith of the Vale Dominion. We are addressing the governing body of the planet designated Earth. You have received our approach signal. You are aware of our fleet strength. We offer you the standard terms of integration, a 40% resource allocation to the Dominion, population classification under Dominion Administrative Code, and full protection under Dominion law in exchange for cooperative compliance. You have 2 of your planetary minutes to respond." Nate set down his coffee. He thought about it the way he thought about most things, briefly, without drama, the way a man thinks about a decision he already made a long time ago. He pressed the open channel button. "This is Commander Nate Holt, Earth Defense Coordination. We heard you." He paused. "That's a no from us." A beat of silence on the other end. The kind of silence that comes from someone who has not heard that word in a very long time. Nate turned away from the channel. He looked across the command deck at nobody in particular and said, simply and quietly, "Activate perimeter." Kara looked up from her gauge. The word went out through 17 encrypted relay systems, down through chains of command that had been built and maintained and tested and never once used in the 31 years since Earth had begun building what it now had. The word moved faster than the light that carried it, faster than the veil could track, because it did not move through space, it moved through infrastructure, through hardware buried in rock and ice and the cold dark between planets, through stations that had no official designation on any record a foreign government would ever be handed. 300 things lit up. They did not light up dramatically. They did not announce themselves. Sensor arrays came online in the asteroid belt, oriented already, aimed already, because they had been aimed for 9 months at this particular approach vector, the one that every human strategic model said a fleet this size would use, the one that made sense given the gravitational lanes and the solar wind patterns and the 17 other factors that humanity's astronomers had spent decades mapping not for science but for this. Weapons platforms that had registered as derelict mining equipment on every skin the Vale advanced probes had run began their power-up sequences. It takes time to power up a railgun the size of a cathedral. The sequences had been running for 40 minutes, since the moment the Vale fleet appeared on sensors. They were almost ready. Deep space monitoring buoys that had been positioned years ago, so far out they had no heat signature worth tracking, opened their eyes. Oritha's sensor team saw it happening. They sent data to the fleet speaker. They sent it twice because the first time they sent it, the numbers did not look like something they had permission to believe. On the command deck, Pete Darrow said, very quietly, "They're scanning us." "Let them," Nate said. "They're running it again." "Good." Kara closed the panel on Deck 7's coolant feed. The pressure was still climbing. Not enough to be a real problem yet. She sat back on her heels and looked at the main tactical screen for the first time since the fleet appeared. She looked at the shape of what was coming, 1,400 ships, organized in a formation she recognized from the coalition threat files she'd read 3 years ago, a formation that had been used in 47 engagements against 47 civilizations. She looked at it for about 4 seconds. Then she opened the panel again and went back to the gauge. It was not that she did not care. It was that the gauge was something she could fix. The 1,400 ships were something else entirely, and worrying about them before a part of the plan began was the same as worrying about weather on a planet she had never visited. It did not help. It did not change anything. It was just energy spent in the dark. Nate's second-in-command, a compact woman named Lou Pratt who had the specific stillness of someone permanently calibrated for bad news, brought him a tablet showing the initial readout from the perimeter activation. 288 systems confirmed online, she said. 12 delayed. Running diagnostics. Any critical gaps? No, sir. Then we're fine. She looked at him. Not with doubt. With the expression of someone who has followed a man long enough to know when he is performing calm and when he actually feels it. He actually felt it. That was the thing about Nate Holt that his people had learned over years and his enemies had never had time to learn at all. He was not performing. He had been calm about this for 31 years, in the slow, settled way of a man who has done the preparation and trusts the preparation, who has looked at the math enough times to know the math holds. Earth had not been building a military. Not technically. Militaries were things you built when you expected a fight. What Earth had built was a consequence. A very specific, very thorough, very patient consequence for the first civilization that looked at the solar system and saw something worth taking. The Veiled Dominion had looked. Oritha's voice came back over the channel. Still formal. A little slower now. The voice of someone reading a room for the first time and not entirely sure what they are reading. Commander Holt. We are observing your defensive activations. We acknowledge the presence of armed infrastructure. We are prepared to reassess the terms of our offer. Nate did not answer right away. He drank his coffee. He looked at the screen, at the 1,400 ships sitting at the edge of his solar system, at the 300 things that were now looking back at them. He pressed the channel button. There's nothing to reassess, he said. We gave you the answer. He released the button. He looked at Lou. Let them think about it for a while, he said. They'll make a decision. Lou said, and if they decide to shoot? Nate looked at his coffee cup. It was almost empty again. Then we find out if the math holds. He said it the way he said most things. Like it was not complicated. Like it was already sorted, and all that remained was waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to a conclusion he had reached a long time ago on a day nobody else remembered. The perimeter held its shape. 300 things waited in the dark. And 1,400 ships, for the first time in the long history of the Veiled Dominion's expansion, did not immediately know what to do next the day aliens learned why Earth is feared as a Class 13 nightmare. Part 2. Orith had fought 40 wars. He had watched civilizations calculate the math of resistance and choose, wisely, to stop. He had seen species with impressive technology and genuine courage make the correct decision when presented with a fleet of 1,400 ships and the historical record of what that fleet had done to the 47 civilizations that came before them. He had never had to fire the opening salvo more than once. The first strike was always enough. The second was just paperwork. He ordered the opening salvo. It went out clean. The formation broke perfectly, the way his crews had drilled it, the way they had drilled it for this specific approach vector against this specific perimeter layout. His tactical models said the human defensive grid would fracture in 11 minutes. Some of his senior officers, running their own numbers, said 9. 4 minutes in, Oritha's second-in-command, a veteran named Vess, said, Fleet Speaker. The models are wrong. Orith looked at the engagement feed. The perimeter was not fracturing. The weapons platforms, the ones his advanced probes had catalogued and mapped, the ones his tactical team had built the strike pattern around, were not responding the way fixed installations respond. They were not static. They were coordinating. Not with each other in the simple way of network defense systems, but in the adaptive way of something that had been taught to think about the specific attack it was receiving and adjust while it was happening. It was the difference between a wall and an opponent. He had expected a wall. Redirect the third wing, he said. Target the relay nodes. If the coordination network goes down, the platforms are just guns. Vess relayed the order. The third wing moved. The relay nodes were not where his maps said they would be. Down in the engineering corridor of the human command station, Kara Voss had finally determined that the coolant pressure issue on Deck 7 was a partially blocked secondary feed line, not the sensor, as she had first suspected, but the line itself, a small crystalline buildup that happened on long-duration postings in the specific temperature range this station maintained. She had the tools for it. She had fixed this exact problem 4 times in 4 years. She worked on it steadily, her hands moving with the automatic confidence of someone performing a task so familiar it required almost no thought at all. The engagement data scrolled on a small screen mounted to the wall of the corridor. She glanced at it occasionally the way a person glances at a clock, not to learn something, just to check. The third wing's redirect. She noted it. Went back to the line. In a bunker carved into the rock of a mountain in Colorado, Deb Okafor sat at a long table with 12 other analysts and a screen that was showing her the engagement data in real time. She had a yellow legal notepad in front of her, the old-fashioned kind, and a pen she had been clicking open and closed for the last 20 minutes. Every time a new engagement event registered on the screen, she wrote a timestamp in her notepad. Not because anyone had asked her to. She had been doing this since the fleet appeared. She would keep doing it until the engagement ended, however it ended. She was building a record, not for the official logs, which were already being maintained by 12 different systems simultaneously, but for herself. For the version of this day she would carry in her own head for the rest of her life. She had written the original threat assessment for Earth's Defense Planning Committee in 2041. 40 pages. She had argued, with data and projections and 3 separate models, that the first contact scenario most likely to occur would look approximately like this: a dominant species fleet, confident in its record, underestimating the preparation time a species with humanity's specific behavioral profile would use between first signal detection and first contact. She had argued that the gap between "they know we're here" and "they arrive" was the only gift humanity would get, and that gift needed to be used completely, without waste, for decades. The committee had thanked her. They had used most of her report. They had left out the parts that sounded too alarming for the political climate of 2041. She clicked her pen. The timestamp for the third wing redirect. She wrote it down. Drew a small line under it. On the tactical screen, Nate watched the third wing move toward relay node positions that were no longer there. The nodes had been repositioned 6 months ago, after the latest update to the Defensive Coordination Protocol. The Veil Advance probes had last scanned the system 14 months ago. There was a 14-month gap between what their maps showed and what was actually there. 14 months was a long time when you were building things. Lou came up beside him with a tablet showing the damage assessment from the first salvo. He looked at it. 3 platforms damaged, 2 offline. 1 frigate hit, contained to the outer hull. He handed the tablet back. "They're good," he said, which was the highest praise he gave anyone. "Their targeting is better than the models predicted," Lou said. "Then update the models." He looked at the screen. "They'll go for the relay nodes next. Second layer is already active." Lou nodded. She had known. She was confirming that he had known. This was how they worked, not checking each other, verifying each other, the way 2 people verify a calculation they both already ran. The Veil third wing arrived at the relay node coordinates. There was nothing there. A moment of sensor confusion. Vess reported it to Orith. Orith looked at the positions on his tactical overlay, at the coordinates his maps had marked with clean certainty, and he felt, not panic, because Orith did not panic, but something adjacent to it. Something that lived in the same neighborhood. A loosening of the ground underfoot. "Where are the nodes?" he said. "Unknown," Vess said. "Scanning." They were scanning for nodes that were now embedded in 3 separate asteroid surfaces, redesignated and repositioned by a maintenance team that had spent 4 months on the task specifically so that this moment, the third wing redirect, which every human strategic model had predicted as the Veil's second move, would find empty space. The coordination network kept running. The platforms kept adapting. In the corridor, Kara finished clearing the blocked feed line. She ran a pressure check. The gauge dropped back into the normal range. She held up the small piece of debris she had pulled from the line, a crystalline buildup no larger than her thumbnail, pale and almost pretty in the fluorescent light of the corridor. She looked at it for a second. She put it in her pocket. Old habit. You kept the thing that almost caused the problem. It reminded you the problem was real. She stood up, closed the panel, picked up her toolbox. On the screen on the wall, the engagement data showed the Veil third wing sitting motionless at empty coordinates. She looked at it. Then she looked down at her toolbox, checking that everything was back in its place. Give her a minute, she said, to no one, which was what she said to every system she had just finished working on. It was a ritual. It meant, breathe. Check. Make sure. She picked up the toolbox and walked back toward the command deck. The engagement was not yet 1 day old. The Veil had fired their best opening pattern against a perimeter that had moved, adapted, and held. Their relay node strike had landed in empty space. Their tactical models were already running 4 minutes behind the reality of what they were fighting. And the thing they were fighting, the thing Oritha's fleet had catalogued as a defensive grid of fixed installations, was not a grid of fixed installations. It was a conversation. A very long conversation that humanity had been having with itself about exactly this scenario for 31 years, with every possible move and countermove already discussed, already planned for, already built into the architecture of what now surrounded them. In Colorado, Deb Okafor wrote another timestamp. Then she clicked her pen closed, set it down, and looked at the screen for a long time without writing anything. She was thinking about page 4 of the 2041 report. The page the committee had thanked her for and then quietly set aside. It was the page about what happens in the second phase, the day aliens learned why Earth is feared as a Class 13 nightmare. Part 3. The battle was 3 days old. The Veil Dominion had lost 212 ships. Not to a single devastating weapon, not to some technology that rewrote the rules of engagement, but to patience. To a defense that did not try to win, that tried, instead, to make every move cost more than it was worth. Every time the fleet pushed forward, something was waiting. Not in the place the maps said. In a different place, a better place, a place chosen months or years before this day by people who had apparently spent a very long time thinking about exactly this. Orith had lost 212 ships, and he had not reached the inner solar system. He called a command council. His senior officers gathered around the tactical table in the fleet speakers hall, all of them carrying the specific quietness of people who have spent 3 days being wrong about things they were certain of. Orith looked at their faces and saw the same loosening he had felt himself on the first day, when the relay nodes were not where they were supposed to be. It had not tightened since. We reassess, he said. Not a question. A direction. One of his senior tacticians, a methodical officer named Brath, placed a file on the table. It was the Galactic Coalition's threat classification record for Earth. The document that had been filed 17 years ago by the Coalition's Joint Assessment Bureau, following a request from 3 member species who had detected early-stage military expansion signatures from the solar system and wanted a formal threat level assigned. Orith had seen the file before. He had seen the classification, Class 13, the only Class 13 ever assigned, and he had read the summary and made a decision about the summary. The decision was that it was political. That the Coalition, which had its own reasons for overstating threats and understating the Dominion's capabilities, had inflated the numbers. Had attached the highest possible classification to a species that was new, territorial, and aggressive in the way all young species were aggressive before they encountered something older and learned to be still. He had not read the full file. Brath set it in front of him now. The full file. 143 pages. Orith read it. His hull was quiet. Outside, through the hull, the solar system held its position around him, the remaining 1,200 ships of his fleet, still organized, still functional, waiting for his next order. He was aware of all of it, the weight of it, the expectation of it. He kept reading. Class 13 designation criteria were not assigned based on military strength alone. They were assigned based on behavioral profile, on what a species did under pressure, not just what it could do. Item 1 in the criteria read, "This species demonstrates no biological ceiling on cooperative aggression under conditions of existential threat." Meaning, the more danger they were in, the better they organized. The worse the situation, the more resources they committed. There was no point at which a human population, facing destruction, became less coordinated. Every data point the coalition had collected across the full span of recorded human history pointed the same direction. Item 4. This species responds to resource scarcity by expanding capability rather than reducing population. Meaning, when they did not have enough, they did not fight each other for what remained. They built more. Always. Every time. Item 9. No recorded instance of unilateral species-level surrender. This species negotiates only from positions of demonstrated force. Meaning, there was no threat large enough to produce the kind of capitulation the Dominion had produced from 47 other civilizations. The threat did not create submission. It created industry. Orith turned pages. He read slowly now, because he was reading carefully, because each item was landing differently than it would have landed 17 days ago when he had been standing on the bridge of his fleet at full strength, before 212 ships, before empty relay coordinates, before a perimeter that moved. Item 11. Do not engage on their ground. There is no terrain on their homeworld they have not already weaponized. He thought about the asteroid belt. About the mining stations. About the derelict platforms his probes had mapped with clean certainty, platforms that had turned out to contain railguns the size of architectural structures, running cold and silent for who knew how many years, waiting with the particular patience of something built by people who understood that patience was itself a weapon. He reached item 17. He stopped. He read it again. He looked at Brath. "Read this," he said, and pointed at the item. Brath read it. His expression did not change in the dramatic way of someone receiving a shock. It changed in the smaller, more permanent way of someone receiving confirmation of something they had suspected but had not wanted to be true. He read it aloud, as Orith had asked. Current visible military capability is assessed to represent approximately 12 to 15% of total deployed human war infrastructure. The remainder is unaccounted for and presumed concealed. The hall was very quiet. Orith looked at the tactical screen. 1,200 ships. The solar system ahead. The perimeter that had already cost him 212 vessels and had not yet shown him everything it had. 12 to 15%. He had been fighting the edge of something. He had been fighting the visible surface of a thing whose actual size had not yet been revealed to him. Every platform, every coordinated defense, every repositioned node, all of it was the outer layer. The part they had decided he was allowed to see. "What are we not seeing?" he said. It was not a question the way he normally asked questions. It was the kind of question a man asks when he is no longer sure the answer will help him, but he needs to ask it anyway because not asking is worse. Brath had no answer. None of the officers in the hall had an answer. They had the same sensors, the same scans, the same 17 years of coalition intelligence that had failed to locate the remainder, the 85 to 88% that the file said was out there, concealed, waiting. In Colorado, Deb Okafor received a priority signal from the coalition envoy station. They had flagged her file. The original 2041 assessment, which had been shared with the coalition's Joint Bureau after a formal information exchange agreement in 2043 and which had formed the basis, with additions and independent verification, of the Class 13 designation. The coalition envoy wanted to speak with her. She wrote the timestamp. She drew a small box around it, the way she did for timestamps she thought were going to matter. She set down her pen. She had been waiting for this call for 17 years. Not with hope. With the specific, quiet, slightly exhausted certainty of someone who wrote a correct thing and then waited for the world to catch up to it. She had written, on page 4 of the 2041 assessment, the primary strategic danger of engaging this species in direct military conflict is not their visible capability. It is the gap between their visible capability and their actual capability, a gap which, given their behavioral profile and their demonstrated commitment to long-duration infrastructure development, will be orders of magnitude larger than any foreign power's intelligence will have successfully measured. She had written that in 2041. She had shown her work. She had cited 30 years of observable behavioral data, construction signatures, energy output trends, and resource allocation patterns that all pointed the same direction. The committee had thanked her. They had kept most of it. They had left out page 4 because, in 2041, nobody on the committee had wanted to be the person who told the public that the gap between what an approaching alien fleet would see and what was actually out there was roughly 85% of everything humanity had built for this moment. It sounded, they said, alarmist. Deb picked up her pen. She wrote, on a fresh line below the box timestamp, 2 words. Page 4. Then she set the pen down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at the screen that was showing her the engagement data, the Frozen Veil fleet, the 1,200 ships that had found the bottom of item 17 the same way you find the bottom of a step you did not know was there. In the fleet speaker's hall, Orith closed the file. He sat with it for a moment, not the file itself, but what the file meant. What it had always meant, from the moment the Coalition Assessment Bureau had assigned the classification 17 years ago, from the moment his advance team had pulled the document and he had read the summary and made a decision about the summary. He had made the wrong decision. He picked up the file. He looked at item 17 one more time. Then he looked at the tactical screen, at the solar system that was now, he understood, not a target but a question about how much of the 85% was oriented toward him, and whether it had been waiting as long as the rest of it had waited, and what it was going to do when it stopped waiting. He did not have the answer. That was the problem. That had always been the problem. He had come here certain. He was leaving certainty behind in the same hall where he had always kept it, and he could already feel how cold the space was without it the day aliens learned why Earth is feared as a Class 13 nightmare. Part 4. Orith's command council lasted 4 hours. His senior officers laid out 3 options. The first was withdrawal, pulling back to the outer edge of the system, reassessing, sending for reinforcements before making another push. The second was a full-speed advance toward Earth, using the fleet's remaining numerical advantage to overwhelm the perimeter before the humans could continue adapting their defensive coordination. The third was a sustained siege, holding position, cutting off the inner system, waiting for the humans to exhaust themselves. Orith listened to all 3. He asked questions. He let them finish. Then he told them what he thought. He thought the file was coalition propaganda. He had spent 4 hours reading 143 pages and had arrived, by the end of them, back at the same conclusion he had reached when he first saw the classification 17 years ago. Because the alternative to that conclusion was something he was not yet prepared to accept, that he had sailed 1,400 ships into a solar system whose actual military capacity he had measured at perhaps 12%, and that the remaining 88% was sitting somewhere in the dark, aimed at him, waiting for a signal he had not yet triggered. He was not prepared to accept it. He ordered the advance. His senior officers received the order. None of them argued. This was the thing about the Veiled Dominion that had made it successful across 5 centuries of expansion: its command structure was clean. You trusted your fleet speaker or you left the fleet. There was no middle arrangement. His officers were not people who had left. The fleet began to move. On the human command station, Pete Darrow watched the Veil formation shift and said, with the same voice he used for everything, they're advancing past the 3rd ring. Nate was on his 4th cup of coffee. He had not slept in 31 hours, but nobody who looked at him would have known that. He looked the same at hour 31 as he looked at hour 1, not rested, not wired, just present. Continuously, stubbornly, unspectacularly present. He set down his cup. He looked across the command deck at Kara, who had come back from the corridor an hour ago and had been running diagnostics on the secondary targeting array ever since, talking to it in a low voice the way she talked to all systems, not sweetly, not aggressively, just steadily, like a person talking a friend through something difficult. He said, "Open the silos." She looked up. He said it again, the same way, same volume. Not for emphasis. Because she had been focused on the array and he wanted to be sure she had heard. She had heard. She set down her diagnostic tool and began the sequence. The word went out the same way the first word had gone out, through encrypted relays, through chains of command, through infrastructure that looked like other things to anyone who had not built it. But this word went further. It went to places that had received no word at all for 9 years in some cases, 12 in others. Places that had been built in the dark and then left in the dark, maintained by automated systems and occasional crew rotations conducted under the cover of cargo flights and survey missions and the dozens of other entirely ordinary reasons a spacecraft might travel to the outer solar system. Under the ice on Europa, in tunnels carved over 8 years of construction by equipment that ran on low thermal signatures specifically to avoid detection, silo doors began to open. In the Kuiper belt, at distances so far from the sun that the light there was thin and cold and almost nothing, 41 vessels began their power-up sequences. They had been sitting dark and cold for between 4 and 9 years, each one, no heat signature, no active systems, no emissions of any kind that a foreign sensor would flag as a vessel. They were enormous. Each one was larger than anything in the Veil Dominion fleet. They had been built in pieces, transported in pieces, assembled in the dark at distances that placed them well outside any scan the Veil advance probes had run on the solar system. They had been built for this moment. Not for a moment like this. For this moment, this specific approach vector, this specific fleet size, this specific sequence of events that humanity's strategic planners had modeled 1,000 times over 3 decades and refined and modeled again until the model was not a prediction anymore but a plan. In asteroid positions across the belt, weapons platforms that had not been on any map the Veil had, not because they were hidden in a simple sense, but because they had been emplaced after the Veil's last scan, in positions calculated to cover the approach the fleet was now making, oriented themselves. Gun emplacements on 3 specific asteroids that had been in slow transit for 9 years, moved by low-burn drives running at energies too small to track over interstellar distances, had arrived at their designated coordinates 8 months ago. They had been waiting since then. 41 vessels lit up in the Kuiper belt like small stars. Kara watched the activation confirmation scroll across her screen. Each line was a system, a platform, a vessel, a weapon, years of construction, years of maintenance, years of cold patience, coming online now, one after another, with the orderly reliability of things built by people who knew they would need to work the first time they were ever used. She said, quietly, to no one, she's still breathing. It was what she said when something she had worried about came through. On the tactical screen, the Veil fleet's advance slowed. It did not stop immediately, the formation was moving, and formations with momentum do not stop cleanly. But the scan data coming back to Oritha's bridge was doing something to the advance that pure momentum could not overcome. It was telling the fleet that the space ahead of them was not what the space behind them had been. Vess came to Orith. He said, with the voice of a man who had spent his career delivering bad news and had never delivered any news quite this bad, Fleet Speaker. We are surrounded. Orith looked at the tactical overlay. He saw the Kuiper carriers. He saw the asteroid emplacements. He saw the Europa launch signatures, close range, inner system, behind the fleet's current position. He saw the full picture that the fleet's sensors were painting for him in real time, and he understood what he was looking at. He was looking at the remainder. He was looking at 85% of something, and it was oriented toward him from every direction, and it had been waiting in the dark long enough that some of it had been there before he had known this mission would happen. Nate pressed the channel button. He said, "We gave you the window." His voice was the same voice he used for coffee refills and tactical decisions and conversations with his crew. It was not a dramatic voice. It was not a triumphant voice. It was the voice of a man saying a thing that was simply true. 2 minutes of silence on the channel. The window closed. He released the button. He picked up his coffee. He drank. Lou was standing beside him. She looked at the screen, at the surrounded fleet, at the activation confirmation still scrolling, at the shape of what 31 years of preparation looked like when it fully unfolded. 9 years, she said, meaning the Kuiper carrier specifically, meaning the fact that some of those vessels had been sitting cold in the dark for 9 years waiting for exactly this. 11 for some of them, Nate said. Lou was quiet for a moment. That's a long time to wait, she said. Nate set down his cup. Ain't complicated, he said. You build it when you have time. You use it when you need it. He looked at the screen. We had time. The day aliens learned why Earth is feared as a Class 13 nightmare. Part 5. The surrender came in 2 parts. The first part came from most of the fleet, from Orith himself, speaking over an open channel in a voice that had lost the formal weight it carried on the first day. He did not use the word surrender. He used the phrase cessation of engagement, which was the Vale Dominion's diplomatic language for the same thing, the phrase that had a long history of being said by other species to Orith, never by Orith to anyone. He said it the way a man says a true thing he has not said before, carefully, like he is learning the shape of it as it leaves him. The second part did not come at all. Two flanking squadrons on the far edge of the Vale formation broke away and ran for open space. They were fast. The Dominion built fast ships, always had. Speed was part of the fleet's design logic, the logic that said you could hit hard and retreat and regroup and hit again, the kind of logic that works when you have room to retreat into. They did not make it past Saturn. The Kuiper carrier group had anticipated the break. Not because any human had predicted which specific ships would run, but because the carrier group's positioning had been calculated to cover exactly that scenario, the scenario in which some portion of the fleet, unwilling to accept cessation, tried to use the approach vector in reverse. The approach vector had been chosen by the Vale because it was optimal. It remained optimal in both directions. The carriers had known that. They had been positioned accordingly, 9 years ago, by people who had been thinking about this moment before Orith had been assigned to lead the mission. The two flanking squadrons were stopped. They were not destroyed, not all of them. Some made it to custody. Some did not. The engagement was brief and very final, and when it was over, the open channel was quiet for a long time. Then Orith asked to speak to the human commander. Nate took the call in the same place he had taken the first call, standing at the command console, cup of coffee nearby, Lou at his left and Pete Darrow pretending to look at a sensor readout he was not actually reading. The command deck was quiet. Not the nervous quiet of the first day, but something older and heavier, the quiet that comes after something large has finished. Orith said, "How long?" Nate waited. "How long have you been preparing this?" Nate looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the tactical screen, at the shape of the surrounded and stilled fleet, at the activation confirmations that had stopped scrolling because everything was already online. He thought about the question. Not about how to answer it, the answer was simple. He thought about what the question meant, about what it cost Orith to ask it, about the 500-year history of a military commander who had never needed to ask it before. He said, "Since the last time." Orith was quiet. He did not ask what the last time meant. There was something in the way Nate said it, flat, finished, not an invitation to ask further, that made asking feel like walking toward something in the dark that you could hear but not see. Orith had spent enough of his life walking toward things in the dark that he knew when to stop. He did not ask. The channel closed. Kara was in the engine room. She had been there since the final activation confirmations came through, working her way down a list of systems that had taken stress damage over the 4 days of engagement. Not catastrophic damage, the station had held, the hull was intact, the critical systems were all running, but the kind of wear that an extended engagement puts on equipment that was built well but not built to be used like this for 4 days straight. She worked through the list methodically, talking to each system in turn. She fixed a coolant regulator. She replaced a sensor coupling that had been running hot since day 2. She found a pressure issue in the main feed line that was not related to the Deck 7 issue she had fixed on day 1, a different line, a different problem, the kind of thing that happened when a station was shaken repeatedly by weapons fire and vibration for 96 hours. She fixed that too. At the end of the list she sat down on the floor of the engine room with her back against the hull. The hull was warm. It was always warm from the inside, from the heat of the systems that ran through it, but tonight it felt like something specific. She put her back against it and felt it humming through her, the low vibration of a station still running, still whole. She did not name what she was feeling. She sat there for a while. The hum was steady. The engine room was quiet around her in the way it was quiet when everything in it was working correctly, which was the best kind of quiet there was. 6 weeks later, a coalition envoy ship arrived at the edge of the solar system. It announced itself before approaching, careful, formal, using all the correct protocols. It was from the oldest spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy, 4,000 years of recorded history, a species so old they had been traveling between stars when humanity was still figuring out agriculture. They had been watching the engagement data since day 1, the way the entire galaxy had been watching, and they had come to understand what they had watched. They asked to speak to the human analyst who had written the threat assessment. Deb Okafor flew up to the orbital conference station in a transport that was too small and too cold and had bad food. She spent the 6-hour flight reviewing her notes. She did not review the 2041 report. She had not looked at the original file in 4 years because she had memorized it, because you memorize the things you write and believe and watch the world ignore and then eventually prove correct. She met the coalition envoy in a conference room with a window that looked out at the planet below. The envoy was a tall creature with 4 arms and eyes that were pale and very old. It was the kind of old that you feel in a room rather than see on a face. It looked at Deb the way something very old looks at something it is trying to understand, not dismissively, but with the specific attention of something that has seen a great many things and is now encountering something that does not fit the categories. It said, through a translator that rendered its voice into flat but clear English, "We have reviewed the engagement record. We have reviewed your classification file. We have reviewed the construction signatures and the timeline of your military infrastructure development. We have questions." Deb said, "I have a slide." She pulled up one image on the conference room screen. It was a graph. Simple, the kind of graph you make when you want someone to see a pattern without decoration or distraction. The horizontal axis was time, marked in years across the full span of human recorded history. The vertical axis was capability deployed in response to existential threat events. Each data point was a crisis. A war. A plague. A collapse. A famine. An event that had threatened, at scale, the continuation of human civilization. The line did not go down. Across centuries, across every catastrophe, across every event that should by any reasonable behavioral model have reduced the species' capacity to respond to the next one, the line went up. The response time shortened. The capability deployed grew. Not always immediately. Not always cleanly. But always. Deb let the envoy look at it. Then she said, "We don't get slower when we're scared." She let that sit in the room for a moment. "We get faster." The envoy looked at the graph for a long time. It looked at the line, at the shape of it, the direction of it, the place it had reached by the present day. It looked at the data points, each one a human catastrophe that had produced not retreat but acceleration. It said, "Is this a biological trait or a cultural one?" Deb thought about it. "We stopped being able to tell the difference," she said. On Earth, in Galveston, Texas, on the 3rd day after the engagement ended, a retired naval officer named Carl Holt, Nate's father, 78 years old, bad hip, still walked to the water every morning, stood on the beach and looked at the sky. It was an ordinary sky. Clouds moving east. A little wind off the water. The sun doing what the sun does. He had watched the engagement coverage the same way everyone on Earth had watched it, on screens, in real time, at all hours. He had watched the Kuiper carriers light up. He had heard his son's voice on the open channel, the flat voice that Nate had inherited from him, not cold but contained, the voice of a man who has sorted the thing in front of him and is simply saying the sorted version out loud. He stood on the beach. He looked at the sky. He thought about the last time, the phrase Nate had used, the 2 words that had ended the open channel conversation and left a 500-year-old fleet commander too quiet to respond. He knew what Nate had meant. He knew because he was 78 years old and he had studied history and he had raised a son who studied history, and they both knew that humanity had been here before, not here exactly, not this specific threat, not this specific fleet. But in the general place of it. In the shape of it. The last time was every time. Every time something had come for humanity and humanity had not stopped. Had not slowed. Had looked at the size of what was coming and had reached, not for surrender, but for industry. The sky was ordinary. He stood in it for a while. Then he turned around and walked back home, his hip complaining at him the whole way, the water behind him doing what water does. The coalition envoy's report, filed 6 weeks after the meeting with Deb Okafor, updated the Earth classification record with a single additional line beneath the existing criteria. It read, "The Class 13 designation is confirmed and is considered permanent. Reassessment is not recommended. This species does not reduce its capability in the absence of threat. It maintains and expands. The visible portion of its infrastructure at any given time should be considered a lower bound, not an estimate." The line after that read, "Do not attempt to establish the upper bound. No one in the Galactic Coalition ever did."